I think last night, Saya Bojwani suggested to us that demography is not destiny, and I think she made a very good point about it. But demographics are very important nonetheless. And I thought we might start by understanding where we are in terms of the numbers here in Florida. And I think Bob may comment a little further on that. But in fact, we are a state that has had phenomenal growth, 460% in the last half of the 20th century, making us one of the largest and the fastest growing state in the United States. And between 2010 and now, our population has swelled to over 20 million people. When we look at those folks by age groups, we find that in 2010, 17.3% of our population were people who were over 65, and that has grown in 2016 to 19.98%, almost 20% of the population, making us the largest state in terms of a senior population in the country. Maine happens to be second and happens to be where I have my second home, so I like hanging out with those kinds of people, since I am one myself now. And by way of context, it might be good to also look at the rest of the population, because as it turns out, we have the most unique, diverse mix, a very unique, diverse mix in the country. So, for example, for those who are under 18, we have 21% of the population is under 18. 19.1% are foreign-born, 24.9% are of Hispanic origin, 16.8% African-American, and 3% Asian. So it is a very unusual mix, and the diversity in itself presents some great challenges and opportunity, providing us with a very rich culture and great opportunities in terms of having a senior population that also tends to be fairly well educated in terms of other states as well. So one of the great challenges we face is how to encourage that generation to be as involved as possible, and that's what today's session is about. It started as a session focusing primarily on seniors, but the leaders, a very wonderful group of leaders who you'll meet, I think from a very early part of their working together decided on a philosophy and a strategy that the best way to engage seniors is to encourage intergenerational connecting and service. And one of the best ways to help young people is to do that. And that's one of our great needs here in Florida, because we do have such separation between generations and lack of opportunities for them to connect for a variety of reasons. And so today we're going to focus on that great opportunity. So I wanted to provide that as just kind of a background, Bob, for your further explanation.
So I'm going to very briefly flash through several slides that really are drawn from the work group's product. And the work group product is in your packet, and they welcome any additional comments you may have on that draft. It's about 4 or 5 pages. And that draft will become a paper probably in early 2018. So today's discussions are going to feed into that. Any comments you want to make to the work group themselves, you'll see there's contact information. So on behalf of the work group, I'm just going to roll through just to get a sense of what's in that report. So these were the kind of the challenges, the questions that were kind of presented to the work group in terms of how are 50-plus members of the population in Florida impacting civic culture, and to what extent should we be thinking about the interconnections of generations here to not just focus on one side of that equation, but actually put those together as a strategy. And so those are the key questions. From the briefing paper, there was a definition of intergenerational civic engagement that was offered. Opportunities for youth to support elders, elders to support youth, and multi-generational teams working together to address community issues. So that was sort of just to set the frame for kind of the topic that we're going to explore now. There was also in the background section this longevity dividend. I mean, this is an opportunity. This is an investment opportunity. And when you look at all of the descriptions that we looked at yesterday in terms of civic education and philanthropy and volunteering, we really need to look at this as a real opportunity area and to enhance and increase the engagement of both seniors and youth in the effort. So that's a promising thing. They have some statistics in the background. I just drew a couple of things out. This is sort of an interesting view of Florida when you think about it by generation. So you have about 500,000 left of the GI generation, born between 1901 and 1930. Then on the other end, for the Generation Z boomlets, 2001 plus, there are 3.5 million. And the largest of the group are the Generation Y millennials at about 5 million, close behind baby boomers, nearly 5 million. So if you look at it from a generational perspective, and the group was sort of saying, in essence, we have 6 generations that we need to think about in terms of integrating their engagement into civic life and communities in Florida. So these are just some statistics, some of which mirror and resonate with Stu's earlier ones, but these are sort of, you'll see these in the background section of the paper. There are a set of challenges that are listed, and this is sort of just the headlines. There's a lot of explanation, so if any of these you wonder what is actually intended or meant here, you need to read the paper. But these are the areas of challenges that were suggested thinking about, well, how do you engage with intergenerational civic engagement? These were some of the challenges that need to be addressed and faced. This was a vision of where they thought we could go with this. And the way I would describe it is they said, really this presents we should be enhancing and facilitating a laboratory of civic engagement within and across generations, and we should be tapping the institutions, the educational institutions in Florida to really help facilitate that effort. So you'll see in the strategies, these are, to some extent, with each of the work groups, the strategies most of them will talk about repositories of some sort to try and gather best practices and the like. Here they also thought about integrating and adapting school-based intergenerational models. It's an application opportunity. It's sort of part of the laboratory concept, and then create educational resources, and finally conduct research. And these were the topics of research, and they're laid out in a lot more detail in the paper, but just so you get just a sense of things, work with veterans and using this as a way to both draw veterans in and connect veterans in terms of the generations and intergenerational. Older adults and intergenerational civic engagement, age-friendly communities, so that's another kind of context for where this work might really take hold quickly and be able to demonstrate some efforts, and then school-based generation-to-generation programming. So with that, that's just to give you a sense of the working paper and kind of the context for this. So we're going to hear from 2 showcases, and the way we've been doing this, and I'll say this to Mark, is we've tried to give some quick examples to ground it in actual examples, showcase examples of the topic, and then we've moved into the more abstract discussions of strategies and the like. So Eric, you are up first, and I will cue up the slide.
You guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, this looks familiar.
That's yours. I borrowed that. Let me get you back to the beginning.
Okay. So I first met Brian Jacobs when I was teaching a class at USF on the challenges that veterans face when they're reintegrating into American society. Brian was a student there at the time, and he had heard about the class, and he came to me and wanted to share his story with me. So Brian was a Navy corpsman. For those of you who are not familiar with Navy corpsmen, they're naval medics that are attached to Marine combat units. And as a Navy corpsman, Brian deployed twice to Iraq. He was in several combat missions, including the bloodiest battle in Operation Iraqi Freedom, the Battle of Fallujah, where he was awarded a Navy commendation for his bravery in treating wounded Marines. But after 2 combat tours, Brian decided it was time to get out of the military. And as he told me, when he got out, there was no welcome home parade, there was no celebration, there was no parties. It was just do some paperwork, 7 days later, you're out. So you're going from combat in Iraq to home, 7 days later, you're out, right? So as it turned out, the only job that Brian could find when he got out was as a phlebotomist. I had to look up what a phlebotomist was, but it's the person that draws blood when you go to the lab corps or something like that. So apparently that was the only job he was qualified for. So quite a different sense of purpose, saving lives on the battlefield, going home to drawing blood. So Brian had lost his sense of purpose. In addition to that, he had lost his sense of community. You know, when you're in the military, especially in a combat situation, the person to your left and the person to your right's lives depend upon you, you very quickly develop close bonds with those individuals. So he had lost that. So to fill the void of community, he did what most of us would do, and he got married, right? So, but as he explained to me, it wasn't a great marriage. It was something he was just trying to fill that void. It wasn't really a marriage of love. So unfortunately, as quickly as he got married, he pretty quickly got divorced. The challenge with that is that he was living with his wife at the time, who was a Navy nurse in base housing. So when Brian got divorced, not only did he lose his wife, he lost his home. So he spent the next 3 months living in his car under the Hampton Bay Bridge. So Brian had lost his sense of purpose, he'd lost his community, he'd lost his wife, and now he'd lost his home. Unfortunately, things get worse for Brian from there, because Brian had a brother who was in the Marine Corps. And his brother had also served combat tours in Iraq, and he got out. And he faced a lot of the similar challenges that other veterans face when they get out. And unfortunately, he didn't have the strength to endure the transition, so he ended up taking his own life. He shot himself. So Brian had lost his sense of purpose, he had lost his community, he had lost his wife, he lost his home, and now he'd lost his brother. So he pretty much hit rock bottom. So he went home to visit his family, and he was going through his brother's room and some of his brother's belongings. And he found his brother's unit coin, and the slogan on that unit coin was, "My brother's keeper." Right? So you can imagine that hit Brian really hard, because he felt like he had failed to be his brother's keeper. He hadn't protected his brother's life. But that also served as a turning point for Brian, because at that point he sort of committed himself to ensuring that other veterans didn't meet the same fate that his brother met. So Brian sort of recommitted his life to a new purpose. He went back to school. He was trained as a chef. He said he always loved to cook. And after he became a chef, he created a program called Vets to Chefs, where essentially he created a program to train homeless and displaced veterans to become chefs. So he provided housing for a small group of veterans, and he provided a life skill, a job skill that they could use to have a meaningful career. So over the past 3 years, Brian has successfully trained and took 30 homeless and displaced veterans and made them into chefs. So it's been a successful program. Brian's story is a success story of overcoming this particular adversity. So it's a great story, but you may be wondering, what exactly does it have to do with civic engagement, right? I think there are a couple of themes that jump out from Brian's story that speak to civic engagement. One is this notion of a sense of purpose to something larger than yourself, and the other is the importance of community, right? And we saw that in Brian's life. And those are themes that animate a lot of veterans' lives. So in 2016, there was a report that came out by the National Conference on Citizenship that compared veterans' rates of civic engagement to sort of average Americans' rates. And there are a lot of the dimensions, the same sort of census data that we've been looking at over the past year, but you can see on these 4 dimensions here, and there are other dimensions as well, veterans have higher rates of civic engagement than average Americans. Should also say that Florida per capita has more veterans than any other state in the United States, and has the third total amount behind California and Texas. So there are a lot of veterans in Florida. Okay, so what does that have to do with intergenerational civic engagement, right? I'm getting there. There was a There was a study that came out in 2009 by Civic Enterprises looking at veterans and civic engagement and looking particularly at the areas of interest that veterans were interested in serving. The first ones are not surprising, right? So 95% wanted to serve wounded veterans, 90% wanted to serve other veterans and their families, 88% wanted to serve in disaster relief. Here we're getting to the intergenerational part here. 86% of veterans said they wanted to serve at-risk youth, and 82% of veterans said they wanted to help older Americans. So there's clearly an intergenerational interest there among veterans regarding civic engagement efforts. All right, so finally to my showcase example of intergenerational civic engagement among veterans. There is a group called the Mission Continues, and they're a veteran service organization that helps veterans reintegrate by providing them with community service opportunities. And the way they do it is they have service platoons all across the United States. There are 50 to 60 service platoons, and there are currently 5 in Florida. And I just wanted to point out the work that the Orlando platoon is doing here in Orange County. As you can see, each group, you may not be able to read it, it's kind of small, has a unique mission. And the unique mission area of the Orlando platoon is helping disadvantaged youth. For example, last month they did a project called Operation the Kids Table, where they partnered with a local food pantry to build picnic tables to ensure that disadvantaged youth had the facilities that they needed when they came to get food at these food pantries. So this is just one example. As I said, there are other platoons out in Florida who are doing very similar work. But I think it's a great example of intergenerational civic engagement, and I would just submit to the Florida Civic Advance that I think we could really benefit by learning more about the civic engagement efforts of veterans in Florida. Thank you.
Eric, I think I told some of you that I met with Governor, former Senator Bob Graham, and we heard about his book yesterday, America, the Owner's Manual. Well, it turns out that Eric uses this book in his course on political science, and I told the governor about your work and your concern about veterans and their potential role in serving, and he was fascinated by it. So, number one, he wants to meet you, and number two, he wants you to have this inscribed copy of his book, Eric. So thank you.
So Jack, you're here. Did you want to stay on the floor, or are you? Okay.
Good morning. This is my only PowerPoint, so pay attention. And I love those who can organize PowerPoints. I'm just not one of those guys. So I'm an intergenerational family policy advocate. That's my profession. And I come to this fairly honestly. My father was 60 when I was born. I usually get at least one amen from my father in the cheap seat, so let me make sure you heard that. And by the way, in 1951, when I was born, 60 was kind of old. And I'm here to give testimony that it ain't old anymore. Any amens in that one? My father was born in 1891. So when I came to Florida in 1978, following Love and Love Remained, I realized that while my father was old and I read for him, he was also a blind man, by the way. He turned blind in 1942. He was 51. I came along 9 years later, which proves that you don't need great vision for everything. As a matter of fact, they say when some senses go, the other ones perk up a little bit. Have you heard about that? So I kind of lived in 2 generations right away because my father's gang, his old gang, used to come to him because my father could not safely drive to see them, so they all came to my dining table. So I was immersed in the wisdom, the energy, the enthusiasm, the history of older folks. Remember, I'm 10, they're all 70. So I used to eavesdrop on my father, which is easy to eavesdrop on a blind man. And when he was on the phone, he used to tell everybody that he wanted his little Jack to become a teacher. He was pretty firm. I mean, when my father wanted your opinion, he gave it to you. So I followed that path and became a teacher, and then grad school in child development, and then Florida, Tallahassee, Florida, in 1978. Taught delinquent kids for about 2.5, 3 years, and then fell into this advocacy profession at age 28. So I go to this meeting in Jacksonville. I was invited to come because somebody had enthusiastically come down from a conference in Louisville, Kentucky, with an idea. It was a conference called CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates. And these 4 women had gone up from Jacksonville to this conference, and they came back and they convened this meeting. And I guess the overall attitude is if they could do it in Kentucky, we could do it here. No offense to Kentucky, but that's where the conference was. And I was in the room observing, meeting these wonderful advocates. And the whole premise was we could have citizens involved in our dependency court system. These are abused, neglected, or abandoned children, and have them involved as advisors to the court, to the judge, who was making life and death decisions over these children, where to place them in shelter, which foster home to put them in, those kinds of things. Not instead of the caseworker, but the caseworkers had 40 kids, and the CASA folks had 1 or 2. So the first thing that happened is a judge named Louis Safer, his last name is Safer, which is Hebrew for book, so I guess that kind of gave him the destiny of being in the law. He said, well, let's change the name. I'm not sure I like CASA. And he wanted to make it a Latin word, so it became guardian ad litem, guardian under the law. And the big conversation at that meeting, again, I remember it very, very clearly, was how many can we recruit to be volunteers to learn about these individual children and bring a report to the judge? How many can we get? And one woman said, we could probably find 50 folks. And these were from civic groups like the League of Women Voters, National Council of Jewish Women, Junior League. It was all a women's discussion, except for me and the judge. And one said, 50? No. Let's try for 25. Let's set our sights a little lower. We don't want to be a failure. So I went back to Tallahassee to report about the meeting, and we decided we needed legislation to govern this because that's what they learned at the conference. You can't just create a program. There has to be some authorization. So the legislation was created and passed in 1980. And in 1981, we were looking for the right place to start it as a pilot. That's what we do in Florida. We start in one place and see if this can even work. So it was the 4th Circuit, which is Jacksonville and Nassau County, or Duval and Nassau County. And we not only got 25, but in the first year we went way up to 100. And the judges were happy because they got better reports. The young people were happy because they had a one-on-one contact. And it turned out that the volunteers who we got from civic clubs, including some guys, were almost all over age 50. And it's kind of a natural understanding. More time, more life experience, maybe a little bit more wisdom. Okay, fast forward 37 years. From the pilot in Duval County, Jacksonville, 1980. We are now touching on 11,000. 11,000 volunteer guardians ad litem, or as I call them, time philanthropists, serving 26,000 plus children in our dependency system. The stats are about the same, 2/3 over age 50. And the judges are still in love with them. And the kids are in love with them. And the community is in love with them. And here's the essence. The essence is what these children needed most, and they still need most, is a trusted adult who knows their name and cares for them. And we have expanded the role to not only be representative in the court, in a formal process of the court, but they've become mentors to these kids. We've expanded their role, education mentors if the child has a special ed need, mental health mentors. So we're talking about an attachment. So I'll tell you one quick story of one guardian ad litem, because I am honored to travel the state and meet these folks. So this is about Adolphus Hill, who came from Illinois, gentleman in his mid to late 60s. Adolphus said to me, if anybody looks at me and thinks I'm done, I'm going to kick their ass, in a polite way. So he was a corrections officer in a youth training facility. That's usually a euphemism for institution in Illinois. And he shared the story with me. He said almost every kid who came in there were 80 or so, were kind of done. Not that he couldn't keep them safe, but he felt they didn't have a bad life. I mean, they didn't have a bad night, they had a bad life. And they came to him way after the process of their abuse, neglect, abandonment, and there they were, and then they had a bad night, and they were sent to his facility. And he said, when I retired with a plan to go to Florida, this happened to have been Charlotte County, demographically our, quote, oldest county, he said, I'm going to prevent other kids from getting on the wrong track because I remember the faces of the kids I couldn't help when I was a correction officer. That was his individual redemption motivation for becoming a guardian ad litem. And he shared with me that he's had over 20 young people, and he specializes in teen boys. So that's one of 11,000 stories, not only of individual elevation, but of changing kids' lives. Thank you.